Welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. I'm your host, the Duchess, and today we're diving into yet another gorgeous Regency romance story. This is a tale of a woman who was cast aside, dismissed, and forgotten, only to quietly bring an entire empire of pride and privilege to its knees with nothing but a pen and a secret. So settle in, dear readers, light your candles, pour your tea, and let the story begin.
She had 1 minute, maybe less, before 200 people watched her world end. Elara Sinclair stood at the edge of the Veyrmount ballroom with a champagne glass in her hand, and a smile carved so carefully into her face that her cheeks had gone numb an hour ago. The chandeliers were blinding. The orchestra was playing something in E minor that felt, in retrospect, like a warning. And Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Veyrmount, her betrothed of 18 months, the man whose ring she had been wearing since the autumn before last, was walking toward her with that particular expression she had learned to dread. It wasn't anger. Neither was it coldness. But something far worse: consideration. Edmund only looked like that when he had already made a decision and was now simply managing its delivery. She gripped the champagne flute, waiting for him to approach. Elara thought, very clearly and very calmly, here it comes. What she could not have known, what no one in that ballroom could have known, was that in approximately 6 weeks, Edmund Ashford would be standing in a literary salon publicly defending the woman he was about to humiliate. That in 3 months, the most decorated soldier in England would be sitting at her kitchen table reading the last page of her novel with her hand in his. That the anonymous serial novel she had been secretly publishing for 3 years, the one that had brought the entire aristocracy to its knees every Thursday morning, would be announced in front of the king himself as her own. She could not have known any of that. All she knew, in that moment, was that Edmund was 4 steps away, and his face looked like a verdict she certainly wouldn't like. He reached her, then took her gently, by the elbow. He leaned close enough that his voice would not carry, a courtesy she would later understand was extended not for her sake, but for the management of the room. He bends closer, his breath warm against her temple. And in a voice so composed it could have been dictating correspondence, Edmund spoke. "Don't look startled," he murmured, eyes still on the crowd. "They are watching." There's a small pause as the orchestra swells. "I've given the matter a great deal of thought." His thumb presses gently against her elbow, reassuring, almost tender. "And I believe it would be unkind to continue." For a moment, Elara doesn't dare breathe, she just stands still, waiting for him to finish speaking. "You deserve a life that suits you better than Veyrmount ever could. There. Clean. Bloodless. A mercy killing disguised as concern." He had officially ended their engagement. "As for tonight, I suggest you claim a headache." And with that, he walked off, leaving Elara standing in the middle of the ballroom in utter shock. 200 people pretended not to notice. But Elara knew that every single one of them did. And in a corridor just off the ballroom, leaning against a marble pillar in a military uniform, with eyes that missed absolutely nothing, Sir Callum Drest watched it happen, and felt something shift in his chest that he would spend the next 6 months trying to correctly identify.
This is the story of what happened next, and I promise you, there's absolutely no way you are not ready for it. If you're new here, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs a story that actually delivers. And if you've been here before, then you already know. Let's go.
The night before the ball, Elara had been awake until 2:30. She did not know it would be her last night as Edmund's betrothed. Although, she definitely wasn't thinking about Edmund at all, which, if she was being honest with herself in the privacy of her own mind, said everything that needed to be said about the state of their engagement. She was thinking about Chapter 17. Her writing desk was tucked into the corner of her bedroom, positioned with deliberate practicality beneath the room's best window so she could use natural light during the day and the street lamp's pale glow at night when the candles ran low. Tonight the candle was nearly gone. Her fingers were ink-stained past the second knuckle. On the desk beside her manuscript sat a cold cup of tea, a stack of her father's unopened creditor letters. She had stopped opening them because the numbers no longer changed in any direction that helped, and, slightly apart from everything else, a small ivory envelope bearing the Veyrmount crest. Her engagement ball invitation. Printed with her name, and delivered 3 weeks ago. She had never quite found a place for it that felt right. She sealed the finished chapter into its envelope for the printer and set it with the care of something that actually mattered. Then she picked up the Veyrmount invitation and held it for a moment the way one holds a thing before putting it down for the last time. There was nothing wrong with it. It was correct in every detail. Elara Sinclair and Edmund Ashford, Duke of Veyrmount. The date. The address. The formal flourish at the bottom that some secretary had signed on Edmund's behalf. She set it back down, let out a deep sigh, and went straight to bed, falling asleep within minutes. The D-Day finally came, and Elara wore pale gold to the ball because it was her best dress and she was not a woman who saved things for occasions that never came. The evening started the way all these evenings usually started, a receiving line, a crush of perfume and powder and practiced pleasantries, 3 separate women asking her if she was nervous, which was the sort of question people asked when they already suspected the answer and wanted to watch you manage it. She was not nervous. She was something more complicated than nervous. She was tired, in the bone-deep way that comes not from a single bad night but from a long accumulating weight, the kind you stop noticing because it becomes indistinguishable from ordinary life. She danced, drank, and made conversation with Lord Pemberton's wife about the Lady Vale's recent novel, and what she thought of its themes. Lady Pemberton said it was very bold. But Elara said she thought boldness was rather underrated. Lady Pemberton laughed and patted her hand and said she must meet the author someday. Elara said she would like that very much. Edmund found her between the second and third dance. She saw him coming before he reached her. She always saw people coming. It was the curse of someone who had spent years watching rooms rather than performing for them, and she turned to face him with the champagne glass steady in her hand and her expression giving nothing away. He was handsome. He had always been handsome, in that cold architectural way, all clean lines and deliberate presentation. He moved through rooms like he owned them, but then again, he did own most of them. He was 31 and had never once, to Elara's knowledge, been uncertain about anything. But at that moment, he looked very uncertain. She could see it in the slight overcorrection of his composure, the way his control was half a degree too precise, which was what control looked like when it was working very hard. He took her elbow and steered her toward the windows. Toward the windows. Of course. Windows were peripheral. Windows were private enough without being suspicious. Elara, he said, and even the use of her name was managed, intimate enough to be courteous, yet nothing more. She waited. I have given this considerable thought. A pause. I have the highest respect for your character. She stared at her champagne glass for a brief moment, then her eyes began to dart across the ballroom. Don't look startled, he murmured, eyes still on the crowd. They are watching. Elara subconsciously stopped, her eyes climbing upward to meet his. I've given the matter a great deal of thought, and I believe it would be unkind to continue this. You deserve a life that suits you better than Veyrmount ever could. The orchestra played something in E minor, and Elara couldn't stomach the thought that he had rehearsed that speech. He'd stood in front of a mirror somewhere in that enormous house and rehearsed it, and her deserving better was the best possible phrase he could possibly think of. I am dissolving our engagement, he said. Effective tonight. I will ensure the announcement is handled discreetly. She lifted her eyes to his. She held them there, steady and clear and entirely, devastatingly empty of what he'd prepared himself for, which was tears. I understand, Your Grace, she said. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Veyrmount, blinked. It was the most rattled she had ever seen him. As for tonight, I suggest you claim a headache, he said coldly, and walked away. Elara stood rooted for a short moment as everyone stared at her. Then, much to everyone's surprise, she handed her champagne glass to a passing footman. Curtsied, to no one in particular, then she walked toward the door. The room did not stop moving. Neither did the music stop playing. 200 people kept performing the elegant theatre of a London ball, and all of them, every single one, tracked her progress toward the exit with their peripheral vision. She made it to the corridor. It was long and marble and lit with a more honest light than the ballroom. Wall sconces rather than chandeliers, the kind of lighting that didn't hide things. She had been in this corridor before, she realized. 6 months ago, arriving for a dinner at Veyrmount House, she had walked this corridor and thought it felt like walking through the spine of something ancient and cold. She stopped walking. Not for drama or anything of the sort. She simply stopped, because for a moment the next step was unclear and she had always needed to know her next step. Her hand found the wall as she took in a deep breath. The kind you take when falling apart is something you cannot allow yourself to do in a corridor where anyone could turn the corner. And with that, she straightened, and told herself that she was going to be perfectly fine. "Take as long as you need," said a voice from behind her, and Elara turned sharply. He was leaning against the pillar at the corridor's edge, broad, unhurried, and in the dark dress uniform of the king's first blade. He was not looking at her with pity, but with a quiet curiosity, and a longing to understand just what it is that he was laying his eyes on. She had seen him before. Everyone had seen Sir Callum dressed. His face was in the illustrated papers after every military victory, which was approximately twice a year. She had simply never been in a corridor with him before. "Are you all right, my lady?" he asked softly. "I'm quite all right," she said, staring at him for a while. "And what's it to you, if I might ask? You don't know me." "That may be true," he said, "but I know you walked out of that room without giving him the satisfaction of watching you break. That tells me enough." The orchestra started something new behind the ballroom doors. Lighter, almost cheerful. The contrast was so absurd she might have laughed if she wasn't currently using all available resources for structural integrity. "He told me I lack substance," she said. Although she did not know why she said it. She had not planned to say anything. Something moved across Callum's face. Not pity, not sympathy, something tighter and more controlled than he'd ever admit. "Then he's a fool," he said, quiet and flat. "And fools always pay for their errors eventually. Every battlefield I've ever walked taught me that much." She looked at him for a moment that was slightly too long to be accidental. Then she put her shoulders back and collected herself, all the scattered, humiliated, quietly devastated parts of herself, folding them somewhere internal where they would keep until she was home. "Good evening, Sir Callum," she said. Then walked out of Veyrmount House and into the night air, her mind fighting desperately to figure out what she would do with the rest of her life. She was home in her writing chair by 11 o'clock. By midnight she had written 4 pages that would become the most read chapter Lady Vale had ever published. She mentioned the ballroom, the windows, the corridor, and then Sir Callum. Elara didn't dare mention his face, or his name, but his stillness, his precision, the leashed thing behind his eyes that she could not name yet but had memorized completely. She sealed it into its envelope at 1:30 and set it with the rest. Elara didn't cry. Not because she was unaffected, but because she had learned, a long time ago, that tears spent on the wrong people were tears you might need later. She was saving them. She just didn't know yet what for. Later that night, Edmund was in his study by midnight, still in his evening coat because removing it required a decision and he was, for the first time in recent memory, having difficulty sequencing decisions. The fire was burning down. The room was very quiet. He had a glass of brandy he hadn't touched. He had done the right thing. He was certain of this. A Duke of Veyrmount required a Duchess of substance, a woman who commanded rooms, who was built for the mantle, who could stand beside him in the spaces his position required and hold her own without visible effort. Elara Sinclair was decent and quiet, but after many careful months observing her, Edmund decided that she was also unremarkable. Kind, but unremarkable. A woman you looked past rather than at. He had done her a service, truly. Better now than 5 years from now when the mismatch would be undeniable and the consequences would be far heavier. He was certain of this. He picked up the latest chapter of Lady Vale's novel from the corner of his desk. He had been reading it for months, as had everyone he knew, as had the king himself, and he settled into his chair and opened it to where he'd left off. He read 3 pages. Then quickly stopped. He turned back 2 pages and read a passage again. Then he set the book face down on his knee and stared at the dying fire. The passage was about a drawing room. About the particular quality of silence in a room where someone is working, not idle, nor resting, but genuinely, unself-consciously working, the way the air changed, the way the space contracted around whoever occupied it. It was the most precise description of solitary industry he had ever read, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, it made him think of something he had glimpsed once through a half-open door at a mutual acquaintance's house during their betrothal. He recalled Elara, seated alone at a writing desk in a back parlor, bent over paper with the total absorption of someone who had forgotten the world existed. He had not gone in, mostly because he hadn't wanted to disturb her. And as time passed, he had forgotten about it. But for some reason, he was thinking about it right now. Edmund picked up the novel again, and ended up reading until 4 in the morning. A week passed, and then Lady Vale's new chapter arrived. It hit London on a Thursday, as it always did. By Friday, Edmund had received 4 separate letters referencing the same passage, a scene in which a high-born duke dissolves his betrothal at a ball with such precise, devastating courtesy that several letter-writers felt the need to add parenthetical notes like, "One wonders who could possibly have inspired this," and, "The detail is uncannily specific, don't you think?" Edmund read the chapter standing at his desk. Then he began, with the systematic precision that had made him one of the most effective men in Parliament, to think about every person who had been at that ball. Every person who might have spoken to the author. Every thread that could lead from that ballroom to a pen name. He thought about it for 3 days and arrived at nothing conclusive. But there was a feeling, quiet, persistent, lodged somewhere below logic, that kept returning him to the same place. Across the city, in the king's private study, Sir Callum Drest was receiving a new assignment. He stood before the king with his hands behind his back and listened. Lady Vale. The crown wanted her found. A royal commendation, the highest civilian honour in England, was to be awarded. The publisher had hit a wall of artful, immovable anonymity, and all other investigative avenues had been discreetly exhausted. Find her, the king ordered Callum, and he bowed in agreement of the quest bestowed upon him. He went directly from the palace to the publisher's office and spent 2 hours reviewing what records were available. The novels had begun 31 months ago. He noted the date. He cross-referenced it against everything he knew, which was more than most people realized, because Callum Drest paid attention to things that most men at his social level considered beneath attention. Lord Sinclair's gambling debts had become critically dangerous approximately 32 months ago. He sat in the publisher's back office with that information and was perfectly still for a very long time. He did not report his suspicion to the king. Instead, he told himself he needed more evidence. He was lying to himself, and on some level he knew it, and that knowledge sat in his chest like something warm and inconvenient that he was not yet ready to examine directly. Sir Callum went home. He read the first chapter of Lady Vale's novel from the very beginning. By chapter 4 he had stopped pretending he needed more evidence. By chapter 9 he understood that the woman who wrote like this, with this particular comprehension of human longing and human failure, this precise, aching understanding of what it cost a person to be invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to see them, was not someone he could hand to a royal court and a commendation ceremony and walk away from. He read until 2 in the morning. Then he went to bed and did not sleep, and in the morning he began finding reasons to cross paths with Elara Sinclair. It was easier than it should have been. They had 3 mutual acquaintances. She walked in the park on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She visited the same bookshop on Saturdays. She attended the literary discussion evenings at Lady Harmon's house on the first Wednesday of each month, sitting in the 3rd row on the left, and she listened to other people discuss anonymous novels with an expression of such careful, controlled neutrality that it made him want to laugh every single time. The first time he sat beside her at Lady Harmon's, 3rd row, left side, entirely by coincidence, absolutely not coordinated. She looked at him sideways and said, very quietly, "You somehow keep appearing." "I have always been in these gatherings," he said. "You simply didn't notice me before." "I noticed you," she said. "You're rather difficult not to notice." "Then I'll adjust my approach," he said. "Please don't," she smirked, and then looked immediately back at the speaker at the front of the room as though she hadn't said a word. It was safe to say that Callum did not adjust his approach. The dinner party came 3 weeks after the dismissal, engineered by their mutual friend Lady Ashton with the subtlety of a woman who had spent 40 years managing drawing rooms and understood that some social situations required active intervention. Elara arrived to find Edmund's name on the seating card directly across from hers. She looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down, because avoiding things only gives them power, and she had been working very hard lately on not giving things power they hadn't earned. Edmund was already seated. He rose when she entered, as etiquette required. Their eyes met for precisely as long as they needed to, and then they both looked elsewhere. What Edmund could not prepare for, what no amount of his characteristic calculation could have readied him for, was watching Lord Pemberton, who was famously difficult to engage, lean across the table toward Elara mid-dinner with the posture of a man who had lost track of time. She was talking. Edmund couldn't hear what she said from his end of the table. The room was too loud, the distance too great, but he could see Pemberton's face, and Pemberton's face looked like a man who had just discovered something extraordinary was sitting 3 feet away and he had no idea why nobody had told him. Edmund looked at her. He actually looked, for perhaps the first time, without the filter of what he had decided she was. She was animated. Not performing, animated, the difference being that performance is for the room and animation is for the idea. She was making a point and believing it fully, and Pemberton was following her like a man following a light through fog, and Edmund felt something shift in his chest that he immediately tried to categorize as indigestion and completely failed. He was still failing at it when the drawing-room doors opened and Sir Callum dressed arrived. Callum's entrance was the kind that happened to men who had been celebrated enough times that rooms rearranged themselves automatically, a wave of attention, names called, two countesses turning simultaneously, their hostess Lady Ashton cutting through the crowd with her hands already extended. He received all of it with the contained, slightly pained courtesy of a man who would have preferred a side entrance and was too well-mannered to say so. He scanned the room. Edmund watched him do it, that quick automatic read of a space that soldiers and chess players shared. It took Callum approximately 4 seconds to locate Elara. And then, without pausing for Lady Ashton, without acknowledging the countesses, without any of the social stops that a man of his position could have been forgiven for making, he crossed the room and sat beside her. Elara looked up. Something in her face opened, briefly, like a door. Edmund picked up his wine glass. He watched them talk for the next hour and a half. He could not hear what they were saying. He watched her hands move when she was making a point. He had not known she talked with her hands, had not noticed this in 18 months of betrothal, and he watched Callum's face when he listened to her, which was the face of a man giving something his complete and absolute attention and finding the experience entirely worthwhile. And then, at a certain moment, Callum said something, leaned close, and said something quiet, and Elara laughed. A real, unguarded, and sudden laugh. The kind of laugh that lives in the body rather than the throat. The whole table looked over. Edmund had never once, in 18 months, made her laugh like that. He set down his wine glass. He said very little for the rest of the evening. On his way out, he passed Callum in the entrance hall. They shook hands with perfect civility. Callum's grip was direct, unhurried. His eyes were level. Edmund had faced men across parliamentary tables and military briefings, and he had always known, instantly, who in the room was actually dangerous. He knew now. "Sir Callum," he said. "Your Grace," Callum said. They both stood there for a beat. Nothing more needed to be said, because everything had been said. Then they parted, and the evening closed behind them, and somewhere across London, Elara Sinclair was at her writing desk with fresh ink and a chapter that wrote itself. The readers were going to lose their minds on Thursday. Edmund suspected it was her long before he could prove it. He just didn't know yet what he was going to do with that knowledge, or with the slow, wrecking realization that he had spent 18 months in the presence of the most extraordinary woman he had ever encountered, and called her unremarkable, and let her go. He sat in his study at midnight, the fire burning, Lady Vale's collected chapters spread across his desk, and he started reading from the very beginning. He was going to be there for a while. Edmund found the proof on a Wednesday evening, completely by accident, the way the most devastating things always arrive, not announced, not dramatic, just quietly there, waiting for you to catch up. He had been reading Lady Vale's collected chapters for 11 consecutive nights. Not obsessively, but systematically. There was a difference, and he maintained it with the same discipline he applied to everything else, even as the hours kept slipping past midnight and the brandy kept going untouched, and the fire kept needing to be rebuilt, all because he kept forgetting to tend it. He was looking for a pattern, a source, some identifiable point of entry, the person, the event, the conversation that had fed Lady Vale her most intimate details. He approached it the way he approached Parliament: gather evidence, construct an argument, arrive at a defensible conclusion. He was on chapter 22 when he stopped. The scene was small. Peripheral, almost. The heroine alone at a pianoforte, practicing the same passage repeatedly, a technical difficulty in the third measure that she kept smoothing over with a particular self-taught adjustment, an unconventional fingering that wasn't in any instruction book but worked, and had clearly been arrived at through private, patient trial and error rather than formal tuition. Edmund read the description twice. Then he set the book down on his desk very carefully, the way a man sets down something he's afraid he might break. He had heard that exact adjustment once. One time, during their betrothal, he had been walking past the music room at the Sinclair house and the door was half open, and he had paused without announcing himself because the playing was unexpectedly good and he hadn't wanted to interrupt it. She had worked the same difficult measure 4 times in a row until the 5th time it came out clean, using a fingering solution entirely her own. He had never mentioned it to anyone. It had not seemed important. It was simply a moment, small, private, and forgotten almost immediately. Except Lady Vale had written it into chapter 22 with the specificity of someone working from memory. Edmund sat at his desk for a very long time. The fire crackled. Outside, London was dark and indifferent, carrying on the way cities carry on regardless of what is happening in the private studies of their occupants. He looked at the open chapter. He looked at his hands. Then at the ceiling. He thought about chapter 1, the tenderness of it, the way the male character based on him had been written then, with a complexity that had always seemed, if he was honest, slightly more generous than he deserved. He thought about how that characterization had shifted, chapter by chapter, incrementally darkening, until by chapter 8 the Duke figure in Lady Vale's story was something much colder and much less forgivable. He had done that. He had written himself into her villain with his own behavior, and she had simply recorded it faithfully, and the whole of England had been reading it every Thursday and never once suspected the author was the woman the story was about. Edmund Ashford put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. Long enough for the fire to burn down to coals. Long enough for the city outside to go fully quiet. When he finally lifted his head, his expression was not the composed, managed face he showed the world. It was something raw and less flattering, the face of a man who has just understood, completely and without any available defense, the size of what he'd destroyed. He did not sleep that night. He was at his desk still when the morning light came through the curtains, Lady Vale's chapters spread around him, and he read every single one of them again from the beginning, not looking for evidence anymore. Just reading. Actually reading, the way she deserved to be read. The way he hadn't read anything in years. By morning he had arrived at a conclusion. Not about what to do, he genuinely did not know what to do, which was a sensation so foreign it felt like a physical symptom. But about what was true. He had been wrong. Edmund would have never admitted it, but the evidence was right before him. He poured himself a cup of cold tea and sat with that for a while. Elara was at the bookshop on Saturday morning when she became aware that she was being followed. Not followed, like a serial killer stalking their next target. Just trailed, at a very polite distance, by a tall man in a dark coat who seemed to have developed an inexplicable interest in the poetry section immediately after she entered it. She picked up a volume of Keats without opening it and said, conversationally, to the shelf in front of her, "Good morning, Sir Callum." A couple of seconds went by, then, from her left, "Good morning, Miss Sinclair. Are you a Keats reader?" His voice came from behind the shelf. "Not particularly." She put it back. "Are you a poetry reader?" "No," he said, not even slightly embarrassed about it. "I followed you in from the street." She turned to look at him. He had already entered the aisle and was already looking at her, which was something she had noticed about Callum. He didn't look away when caught looking. Most people did. Edmund always had. Callum simply held eye contact with the straightforward ease of a man who was not doing anything he needed to be ashamed of. "Why?" she said. "I wanted to ask you something." He paused, without an audience. She waited. "What do you love?" he asked softly. "Not what you're good at. Or what's expected of you. None of that. I mean, what do you actually love?" The question landed differently than any question she had been asked in recent memory. Not because it was complicated, because it was so direct that it bypassed all the social architecture she normally operated behind, and she was momentarily without a prepared answer. She started to say reading. Elara had been about to say reading. She had already shaped her mouth around the word when something stopped her. The quality of his attention, maybe, the fact that he was watching her with eyes that had clearly seen men lie under extreme pressure and knew exactly what it looked like, and instead what came out was writing. She heard herself say it. A moment passed. The bookshop continued around them, completely indifferent. "Writing," he repeated. Not a question. Not surprised. "Reading," she corrected, immediately. "You said writing." "I misspoke." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that said, very clearly and very kindly, that he knew she hadn't misspoken, and that he was going to let her have the correction anyway, but that this was not a conversation that was finished. Then he picked up the Keats volume she had replaced, looked at it as though he found it personally incomprehensible, and set it back. "I'll walk you home," he said. She should have said no. Yet, she didn't. They walked through the Saturday morning streets at the unhurried pace of people who were not in a hurry to arrive because arriving would cut their time short. They found themselves talking about nothing and everything in the way that happens when two people are actually paying attention to each other. He told her about a village he'd passed through on campaign in the south, a bakery there, the smell of it, the way it had made him think inexplicably of being 8 years old and completely safe. She told him about a sentence she'd once read that had stayed in her so completely that she could feel it still, years later, like a stone in still water. He asked her which sentence, and she told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes. I can see why." She looked at him sideways. He wasn't acting like he was understanding. He actually understood her, and she could feel the difference between the two, and it was vast. At her door they stopped. He turned to her. Elara. Her name. Just her name, no title, no miss, just Elara, with the care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I want you to know that whatever you're protecting, whatever it is you won't say out loud, I have no intention of taking it from you. Whatever it is. Her heart did something abrupt and irregular. She kept her face steady as she said, "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said gently. A pause. The street moved around them. A carriage. A dog. The ordinary world. Rushing past while they both held each other's gaze in a moment of pure tension. "Good day, Sir Callum," she said. "Good day," he said. And he walked away without pressing, without looking back, without doing any of the things men did when they wanted you to know how much restraint they were exercising. He simply left, and that, somehow, was worse. She went inside, directly to her desk, and sat down and looked at the blank page in front of her and thought, for the first time in 3 years of writing, that she was not sure she could be objective about what she put on it. She wrote anyway. She wrote him in again, his stillness, his patience, the way he said her name. She wrote the scene without embellishment because it didn't need any. And she was so deep in it that she almost didn't notice, until she was sealing the envelope for the printer, that she had written the knight not as the heroine's champion this time, but as her equal. The shocking part, though, was that her readers were going to understand what that meant, long before she did.
If you've made it this far, you already know this story has you. Go ahead and like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment below. Team Edmund or Team Callum? I need to know. Now let's get back to it, because this is where everything starts to unravel.
Callum knocked on Elara's door on a Tuesday morning, and she opened it herself, which told him two things. She had dismissed the housekeeper for her writing hours, and she hadn't been expecting anyone, which meant her guard was down in a way it almost never was. She was in a plain morning dress with ink on her right hand past the second knuckle. She looked at him, then looked at the novel in his hand. After a small pause, she looked back at his face. The blood left her face so completely and so quickly that he actually took a small step forward in case she needed steadying. "I know," he said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard, and he had been on actual battlefields. "How long?" she said. 3 weeks. Something crossed her face. Not anger, not panic, something more complex and harder to name. "You've known for 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" she asked, but Callum didn't say a single word. "So you're saying the king assigned you to find me?" "Yes." He admitted. "And you didn't tell him?" "No, I haven't told him a thing." She stepped back from the door. He took it as an invitation and entered, because they were past the stage of waiting to be explicitly welcomed, and they both knew it. They stood in her hallway, a hallway with the peeling wallpaper and the uneven floor and the stack of creditor letters on the side table that she hadn't bothered to hide because she hadn't been expecting anyone. He looked at none of it in a way that made her understand he had seen all of it and was making no calculation based on any of it. "But why?" she said. "You could have used it. Finding Lady Vale, the credit alone would have." "I know what it was worth," he said, cutting her off. "I didn't want it." "Why?" she said again, and this time the word was quieter and the question was different. He looked at her steadily. "Because it wasn't mine to take." She held his gaze for a long time, reading him the way she read everyone looking for the seam. The performance. The place where the truth stopped. She found nothing. He was exactly what he appeared to be, which was possibly the most disorienting thing she had ever encountered in a person. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." They sat in her kitchen because the drawing room felt too formal for what this conversation was, and they both instinctively knew it. The tea got made and then went largely ignored. He told her about the king's commendation, the letter, the ceremony, and even the formal recognition that Lady Vale had earned. But he didn't put any pressure on it. He laid it in front of her the way you laid an option in front of someone you respected. "You don't have to," he said. "That is the only thing I want to make absolutely clear. You don't have to do anything." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "If I don't, the investigation continues. Someone else will find me eventually and they won't ask first." "Possibly," he said with a sigh. "I wanted you to have as much time and choice in this as possible. That's all." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" he asked softly. "Giving me back my own agency. Men don't." She stopped. "In my experience, men don't do that." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong men," he said. "Not as an indictment. Just as a fact." The candle between them burned down 1/4 of an inch. She started talking. Not about Lady Vale, but about writing, about what it had meant to her, the desperation of that first chapter and how she'd almost burned it, the terror of submitting it to the printer and the way her hands had shaken. The first letter from a reader, forwarded through the publisher, from a woman who had written, "I thought I was the only one who felt invisible in every room I entered. Thank you for writing it down." She had kept that letter. She still had it upstairs. He listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak. Listening, the complete kind, the kind that most people could not actually do for longer than 90 seconds before they started composing their response. He was completely and utterly still. Then she stopped talking and the kitchen was quiet and she realized she had been speaking for nearly an hour and a half and had said things she had never said to another living person. She glanced at the candle. "I should let you go." He didn't move and instead opened his mouth. "One more thing." She waited for him to talk. 3 years ago," he said, "before I knew anything about Lady Vale or Elara Sinclair, a friend showed me the first chapter. I read it in a pub on a Thursday afternoon. I told him it was the most extraordinary piece of writing I had ever encountered." A pause. "I had no idea. I just wanted you to know that." She turned away from him toward the window because she needed a moment that he wasn't watching her have. "You should go," she said, to the glass. "I suppose so," he said. He stood. He pulled on his coat and walked to the door. "Callum." Her voice called out to him, making him stop. "I'm going to think about the ceremony," she said. "Take whatever time you need," he said with a kind smile. And with that, he left. The door closed with a soft slam. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on the street below, watching him walk away until he turned the corner and disappeared. Then she went upstairs. She sat at her desk. She wrote 12 pages without stopping, the fastest she had ever written anything, and when she finally put down her pen her hand was shaking slightly and the ink was everywhere and what was on those pages was the truest thing she had produced in 3 years of writing the truth. She sealed it. She set it with the rest. She did not notice until the following morning that at no point in those 12 pages did the Duke figure appear at all. That evening, across London, Edmund had arrived at her drawing room. She came downstairs to find him standing by the fireplace in his coat and hat, and the specific quality of his presence in the room, the absence of his usual ownership of spaces, the way he stood like a man aware he had no claim there, told her before he opened his mouth that whatever this was, it was not the Edmund she had been engaged to. "I've read everything you've ever written," he said. "No greeting. No preamble. I started from the beginning. And it's safe to say I understand now." She waited, mostly because she didn't know what to say. "You wrote me in the first chapter." He stopped. Something moved in his face. "Or should I say, you wrote a version of me that understood things about me that I hadn't understood about myself." He met her eyes. "And then I gave you no other material, and you wrote what I gave you instead. And the whole of England read it and I was too." He stopped again. "I was too certain of my own correctness to hear what I was being told." The fire between them popped. But Elara still didn't move. "What do you want, Edmund?" she said. Quiet. His name without the title. They both felt it. "I want you to know that I understand, fully, what I destroyed," he said. Not so that you'll forgive me. Just so that you know the person who wronged you actually sees what they did. You deserve that much. At minimum, you deserve that." She looked at him for a long time. Understanding it doesn't undo it. "No," he said. "Sadly, it doesn't." He turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her, and said, "Your writing is extraordinary, Elara. It always was. The failure of perception was entirely mine." He left. She stood in the drawing room until the fire burned down to almost nothing, and then she sat in the chair nearest the window and looked at the street and felt, for the first time since the night of the ball, the particular internal shifting that happens when multiple things are true at once and none of them are simple. She was still sitting there an hour later when her printer's boy knocked at the door with a forwarded letter from a reader. She opened it, read it, set it down. Then she went upstairs, sat at her desk, and began writing the chapter that would bring all of London to a complete standstill, the one where the heroine finally understood what she was choosing between. She wrote until 4 in the morning. Then she sealed it, addressed it. And in the morning, Thursday morning, all of London received it simultaneously, and read it, and the letters that flooded the publisher's office before noon were unanimous on one thing. Something had shifted in Lady Vale's writing. Something had changed. The story readers wrote felt suddenly, devastatingly real in a way it hadn't before. They had no idea. The literary salon met every other Friday in Lady Harmon's drawing room, and it was, by all accounts, the one space in London where reputation mattered less than opinion. Poets argued with politicians. Viscountesses debated with merchants' wives. Nobody cared who your father was if your point was interesting enough. Elara had been attending for 2 years. She sat in the third row, left side, and she listened and occasionally contributed, and nobody ever looked at her the way they looked at the people who arrived already famous. That changed on the Friday 3 days after Edmund's visit. She arrived to find the room arranged around a central debate, Lady Vale's latest chapter, which had, as predicted, dismantled London's Thursday morning routine entirely. The moderator had barely finished his opening remarks before a man in the second row, a literary critic Elara recognized from the papers, the sort who made his career from confident dismissals, raised his hand and said that while Lady Vale's technical ability was undeniable, the female characters were frankly implausible. Women of her character's social standing, he argued, simply did not think with that kind of interior complexity. It was wish fulfillment dressed as realism. The room murmured. Some agreement and some dissent. The moderator invited responses. Elara opened her mouth. But someone else spoke first. "I know the author personally." The voice came from the 5th row, to the right. Calm. Precise. The voice of a man who did not need volume to command attention because attention simply arranged itself around him automatically. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Veyrmount, sat in the 5th row of Lady Harmon's literary salon in a plain dark coat with no crest, no signet, nothing that announced him to anyone who didn't already know his face. He was looking at the critic with an expression of complete, unhurried composure. Lady Vale, or should I say Miss Sinclair, is, if anything, more remarkable than what she commits to the page, he said, which makes the failure of anyone who overlooked that fact entirely their own, including a pause, brief and deliberate. Myself. The room went very, very still. Elara, in the 3rd row, had stopped breathing. Edmund did not look at her. He returned his attention to the moderator as though he had made a minor administrative clarification, as though he had not just publicly dismantled his own position in front of 40 witnesses, as though the name he had spoken was not the name of the woman he had called unremarkable 7 weeks ago at his own ball. The critic opened his mouth, then closed it almost immediately. The moderator cleared his throat. The room slowly began to exhale. Elara looked at the back of Edmund's head and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It wasn't forgiveness. It was too complicated for that word. It was something more like watching a locked door open from the inside. Something like, "Oh, so that's what you look like when you stop managing yourself." She left before the discussion ended. She needed air. He found her in the entrance hall. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" He looked at her. Fully, the way she had spent 18 months wanting to be looked at and had eventually stopped expecting. "Give me the chance to become someone worth forgiving," he said. "Not a second chance at what we were. Just the chance. I understand the difference between a woman who is quiet and a woman who chooses her words carefully. I understand it now. I didn't before. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove to you that my understanding is real." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. She left. He stayed in the entrance hall and let her go, which was the right thing to do, and it cost him more than he expected, which told him something about himself that he filed away for later examination. It was more than he'd had when he walked in. He chose to count it. The king's letter arrived on a Monday. Formal, sealed, and utterly undeniable. The commendation ceremony was set for the following Saturday. Elara held the invitation for 3 days. She'd held it the way she had once held a Veyrmount ball invitation, but differently. That one she'd set aside. This one she kept picking back up. On Thursday morning she sent her chapter to the printer. Then she wrote a second letter, much shorter, and sent it to the palace. She'd accepted the invitation. Callum was at her door by Friday evening. She had sent him a note. 3 sentences, no explanation, just the time and the address and the fact that she'd decided. He arrived exactly when she'd said to arrive, which she had come to understand was simply how he operated. Callum Dreyest was not early to impress and not late to signal importance. He arrived when he said he would, and this alone distinguished him from nearly every other man she had ever known. She opened the door already in her coat. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite a smile. It was far warmer than that. "You're sure?" he said. "Not a question. A check more or less." "I'm sure," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked. The throne room on a Saturday morning was a different creature from its ceremonial evening self. Morning light through the high windows, honest and direct. The room was full. The king had made attendance known through the right channels, which meant everyone who needed to be there was there, and everyone who needed to witness was witnessing. When Elara Sinclair's name was announced as Lady Vale, the silence lasted 4 full seconds. But then again, for seconds in a room of 200 people is an extraordinary amount of silence. It was the silence of a world reorganizing. Every person in that room was performing, simultaneously, the private arithmetic of recalculation. Every conversation they'd had with her, every time she'd been overlooked, every dinner table where she'd been seated at the far end, every assembly where she'd faded into the background while they walked past. The king began to applaud. And the room followed. She stood at the front with her chin up and her hand steady, wearing a deep green dress she had purchased specifically for this because she was done with fading into backgrounds, and she received the commendation with the grace of a woman who had long since stopped needing external validation to know her own worth, but was definitely not above enjoying the public acknowledgement of it. Callum stood to her right, 2 steps back, in full military dress. He was not applauding. He was watching her with the expression of a man watching something he had been fairly certain was going to be extraordinary and finding, now that it was happening, that he had still underestimated it. Edmund was in the 4th row center. He stood with everyone else. He clapped steadily and did not stop when the people around him began sitting back down. He was the last person in the room still standing. Elara from the front saw him do it. Their eyes met across the throne room, across 200 people, across 7 weeks, across 18 months. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Not with triumph. Not with coldness. With the clear, quiet look of a woman who saw someone completely and had simply, finally, stopped pretending otherwise. He was the one who finally looked away. He sat down, folding his hands in his lap. And Edmund Ashford, Duke of Veyrmount, who had not been uncertain of anything since approximately age 19, sat in the king's throne room and accepted, with a dignity that cost him enormously, the precise dimensions of what he had lost. London erupted. There was no other word for it. By Saturday evening the gossip columns had columns within their columns. By Sunday the illustrated papers had drawings. By Monday the literary world had opinions, and the aristocratic world had opinions, and the 2 sets of opinions were furiously incompatible, and the argument was the most interesting thing to happen to London in 2 years. Both men came to her separately. But neither knew about the other's visit. This was not an accident. Elara had arranged it deliberately, because she was a writer and she understood that some scenes needed their own space. Edmund came on Tuesday. He sat across from her in the drawing room and he did not make a case. He simply told her the truth, which was that he had spent the last 2 months discovering he was capable of a kind of feeling he had spent his entire adult life systematically preventing, and that the feeling was inconvenient and persistent, and showed no clear signs of resolving itself in any direction that didn't involve her. "I'm not asking you to forgive the man I was," he said. "I'm asking you to consider the man I'm becoming. And I recognize that you have no particular reason to trust that distinction." She looked at him and asked, "What changed?" With a sigh, Edmund answered, "Nothing. You were always extraordinary," he said. "I was the variable. I had decided what you were before I had actually looked at you. And when things didn't fit my decision, I adjusted the evidence instead of the conclusion. I do that with everything." There was a small pause. "I'm trying to stop." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. It landed in her chest and stayed there. She said, "I'll think about it." He nodded, stood, and left without pressing. And in the way he had begun to let her breathe, she could feel how much he had actually changed and how much it had cost him. Callum came on Thursday. He came in the evening after her chapter was already sealed and sent, and he sat at her kitchen table. Their table, she had started thinking of it as their table, which was information she was filing away for later, and he did not make a case either for entirely different reasons. "I'm not going to tell you what to choose," he said. "I just want to be clear about that." "Then why are you here?" she said. "Because I thought you might want company," he shrugged. "And because there are things I haven't said that I think I should say before you decide. It isn't to influence you if that's what you think. It's just because they're true, and you deserve to have true things said to you." She didn't say a word and instead waited for him to continue. "I noticed you before the corridor," he said. "At a gathering 3 years ago, before Lady Vale, before any of this. You were in a room full of people performing themselves and you were the only person in it actually listening. I thought," he stopped, almost smiled. "I thought I'd never seen anyone so completely themselves in a social room in my life. I didn't know your name. I didn't try to find out. I was leaving the country for campaign in 2 weeks and it didn't seem," he paused. "It seemed like the wrong time." She was very still. "And then March happened," he said. "There you were. In a corridor. And I thought." He looked at her with those direct, steady eyes that never performed anything. "I thought, that's her. That's the woman from 3 years ago." And someone had just told her she lacked substance. The kitchen was completely quiet. "Callum," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking," she said with a small giggle. He stopped himself almost immediately, fighting the smile that threatened to break out. She looked at him across the table, the kitchen table, the honest one, in the honest house with the peeling wallpaper and the real life, and she felt, with a clarity she had been circling for weeks, the exact shape of what she knew. She had always known that was the thing. She had known it in the corridor. She had known it in the bookshop. She had known it at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning when he listened to her like listening was the most important thing he'd ever done. She had been writing it into every chapter for weeks and the readers had known before she let herself figure it out. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over, held hers. Neither of them said anything for a long time because at that moment, nothing needed to be said. Sometimes some things are complete without being spoken. Outside, London carried on. Thursday arrived, the way it always did. The final chapter of Lady Vale's serial novel reached London simultaneously, as it always had. Bookshops, clubs, drawing rooms, the palace. The king read it before breakfast. Edmund read it alone in his study at 7 in the morning, still in his dressing gown, with the fire rebuilt and the room quiet. He read it slowly, all the way to the end, to the last line. She had spent her life being invisible to people who were looking. She did not intend to spend the rest of it being looked at by someone still learning how to truly see her. She had found, at last, the person who saw her, not as she might become, but as she already was. And that she had decided. was the only kind of love worth having. He set it down, looked at the fire for a long time. Then he looked at the window. Then he did something that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was 3 months ago. He nodded. Slowly. To himself, to the empty room, to the verdict that was entirely fair and entirely deserved. He sat with it. Not fighting it anymore. He had spent 18 months fighting evidence that didn't fit his conclusions, and he had decided, with the same finality he brought to everything, that he was done with that. He thought about the salon. About her face when she said, "I'll think about it," about the 2 seconds in the throne room before she looked away. He thought about who she was and who he had failed to be and what the distance between those two things had cost them both. He poured himself a cup of cold tea and drank it. Then picked up Lady Vale's collected chapters, all of them bound now the complete arc, and held them for a moment. Later, he set them on the shelf. Not hidden. Not faced away. Right there, spine out, where he would see them. He had a great deal of work to do on himself. He understood that now with the same clarity he'd once reserved only for parliamentary matters. He was going to do it. Not for her. She had made her choice and it was right, and he had enough honesty left to admit it. But because he had glimpsed, through 3 months of reading and recalibrating, a version of himself he had never tried to be, and he found he could not stop thinking about it. He sat down at his desk, pulled out paper, and began writing. Not to her, not to anyone, just writing, thinking on the page the way she had taught him was possible. He wrote for an hour. It was the most honest thing Edmund Ashford had produced in his entire life. He would not show it to anyone. That wasn't the point. The point was that he wrote it. 6 months later, Elara Sinclair's first collected volume was published under her full name. Both words, no pen name, no veil. The dedication read, "For every woman called unremarkable by a man who simply wasn't paying attention." It sold out in 4 days. The second printing sold out in 2. On the Saturday of publication week, a woman walking through Hyde Park at noon noticed Sir Callum Drayest sitting on a bench near the eastern path with the book open on his knee. She almost called out to him. Then she noticed he wasn't reading. He was watching his wife across the path, where Elara stood in conversation with 3 other women, animated and entirely herself, her hands moving the way they moved when she was making a point she believed in. He was smiling. The specific smile of a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be in the world, and has stopped being surprised by the good fortune of it. His wife laughed at something, a real laugh, and he closed the book without marking his page because he wasn't going to need to find it again for a while. The woman walking past decided not to interrupt. Some scenes didn't need an audience. Across London, in a study on the top floor of Veyrmount House, Edmund Ashford was working. Parliament business, correspondence, the machinery of his considerable life. On the shelf to his left, visible from his desk, sat a row of Lady Vale's original Thursday chapters and beside them the collected volume, spine out, her name facing the room. He worked well that day. He had been working well lately in general. Something had loosened in him that he was still finding words for, a willingness to be wrong, to be uncertain, to sit with a question longer than was comfortable before forcing an answer. He was different. He wasn't the finished project he wanted. He understood that. But he was different, and he had arrived at the quiet, private peace of a man who has accepted a hard truth completely and decided to build something better on top of the wreckage of the old one. On his desk, between the correspondence and the parliamentary briefs, was a single sheet of paper. Not official. Not addressed to anyone. Just handwriting, his handwriting dense and precise, filling both sides of the page. It was the most honest thing he had ever written. He would never show it to anyone. He had written it for himself. And somehow that was enough. For the first time in a very long time, it was simply, quietly enough for Edmund Ashford.
And that, right there, is where we leave them. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of that corridor, that kitchen table, that throne room, then you already know what to do. Like this video. Subscribe if you haven't, because there is so much more where this came from. And drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Was it Callum in the hallway, Edmund in the salon, or that final chapter everyone in London read at the same time? Tell me. I genuinely want to know, and if someone you know needs a story that actually delivers, share this with them right now, before the next video starts. Until next time.